I work at the intersection of design, content, and history. It's an interesting business. I've successfully evaded the Secret Service to meet a president, worn Johnny Cash's black sports jacket, toppled into a Supreme Court justice, FYI, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, exceptionally short, and been instructed by a Nazi-killing soldier on how to make a Molotov cocktail. All true, but more importantly for this morning, in my work, I've learned that experiential design offers incredible possibilities to craft an immersive environment that facilitates a meaningful engagement with the world. When done right, it can be a transformative encounter. This morning, I'll be talking about the large revolution of the American Civil Rights Movement, as told in the Center's exhibitions, and the smaller revolution of experiential design within museums. Our Civil Rights exhibition begins with the Tony Award-winning Broadway director George C. Wolfe. He's won Tony Awards for Best Director for Angels in America and Bringin' the Noise, Bringin' the Funk on Broadway. He was also the Center's Civil Rights Exhibition storyteller and curator. I'd been on the job for less than a month when I met him at his New York City brownstone. After introductions, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're white, don't let guilt get in the way and F up the story we're trying to tell." Mr. Wolfe is the most creatively brilliant person that I've ever worked with, and if I didn't love him right away for obvious reasons, I did come to love him and love the story that he helped the Center's design and planning team tell. Here's some of that story. The Civil Rights Movement was deeply rooted in a philosophy of nonviolence. Protesters went through rigorous training to help prepare them for verbal and physical assaults. Those involved in lunch counter sit-ins would have heard something like this.
How you doing? This your first time, right? So far, so good. It's nice and calm. You'll be all right. Just stay calm. Get up. Get up. Get up. Get up!
If you don't get up, boy, I'm gonna kill you. Right in front of everybody. I'm gonna take this fork, I'm gonna jam it right into your neck.
Yeah. Oh, he's still ugly though, eh? Hey, ain't he ugly?
Thinking he's something he ain't nothing.
You hear that? That's gonna be you, boy. That's gonna be you, boy. If you don't leave now!
Kill it!
Get up!
Get
What you've just experienced was created to honor the brave men and women who participated in the American Civil Rights sit-in movement.
So that's audio from an award-winning interactive that's up in the Civil Rights exhibit. The audio in the exhibit, you put headphones on, it's binaural, three-dimensional sound, and it surrounds you. So if, I haven't asked, but if those of you who haven't been here yet and seen the exhibitions, please, afterwards, if you have a moment, please give it a try. But I wanted to try to immerse you in that a bit, to give a sense of what someone who was a nonviolent protester might have experienced. Do you like history? Odds are it's not your favorite subject, so when telling historical stories, we wanted to do two things. First, construct immersive, dramatic environments that will grab attention in various ways, like that audio. And also, second, focus upon stories and individuals that visitors would find compelling. The following 4 stories are examples of, in the exhibit, of individual bravery and loss, real people standing up for a cause, and the injustice of a racist legal system. Beginning in the 1890s, every southern state and countless communities passed laws to keep the races separate. Named after a 19th century blackface performer, Jim Crow, these laws gradually extended to include all aspects of life. movie theaters and restaurants, water fountains and elevators, parks and schools, streetcars and buses, hospitals, and even the Bibles people used to swear upon in court. And these laws were upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1896 ruled that separate and equal facilities were constitutional. From today's perspective, the Jim Crow laws can seem hard to believe, but they did exist and they had a very real and very harsh effect on the daily lives of many Southerners. In the wake of the bloody Sunday march at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Viola Luozo, a housewife and mother of 5 from Detroit, Michigan, felt compelled to take action. In mid-March, she took part in a Detroit demonstration in support of the activities in Selma. The experience inspired her to travel to Alabama and contribute directly to the voter registration efforts. On the night of March 25, 1965, she and Leroy Moten, a black teenager, were driving on a highway between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama, when a car containing 4 Ku Klux Klan members pulled alongside. 2 shots were fired and she was killed instantly. Moten survived by pretending to be dead when the men looked inside the vehicle. On February 18, 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson attended a voter registration meeting at Vigil for the recently arrested activist Reverend James Orange. State and local police converged on the vigil and attacked both participants and the attending media. Jackson ushered his mother and 82-year-old grandfather to safety in a nearby building, but they were followed by state troopers. When Jackson attempted to defend his mother from the police assault, he was shot twice and beaten to the ground. He died 8 days later. For those of you living in Georgia's 5th Congressional District, that's a photo of your representative as a young freedom rider up top, Representative John Lewis. Federal courts in 1960 had outlawed segregation on interstate travel, but many southern states ignored those rulings. A group of young men and women, many of them trained veterans of the sit-ins and other nonviolent protests, took it upon themselves to act. They began boarding buses in May of 1961, pressuring the federal government to enforce the existing laws. Uncertain of their fate, many had written last letters to family and friends in case they were killed. On May 4th, near Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses was firebombed. Crowds mobbed another bus in Birmingham, badly beating many freedom riders, both black and white. When the initial Freedom Ride protest was called off, veterans of the Nashville sit-ins launched a new set of rides, despite the threat to their safety. They encountered hostile mobs again in Birmingham and Montgomery before ending their trip in Jackson, Mississippi, where they were arrested and jailed. Throughout the summer, hundreds of new Freedom Riders descended upon Jackson, only to be arrested and sent to jail. Rather than break the spirit of the Freedom Riders, jail fortified their resolve and defiance. College students and other protesters from around the country continued to put themselves online and risk prison. After agreeing to work on this project, George Wolfe toured all the major civil rights museums and exhibitions in the South, and he felt one vital point of emphasis was missing in them: the celebration of the fact that the American civil rights movement succeeded. In the long view, we are still very close to this history. George said that as an African American born in Kentucky, he thought that a large part of the African American community didn't celebrate the success enough. In the Civil Rights Exhibit conclusion, we feature a wall with as many of the laws that we could fit that were passed because of the movement. These are the concrete legislative achievements which transformed America, transformed the country we all live in today, and that which we are beneficiaries of. And it's the lasting legacy of those who worked, struggled, and sacrificed for this noble cause. As I was working on this talk, the horrible murders in Charleston occurred. Based on what we currently know, the perpetrator of these despicable and cowardly acts had his own evil revolution in mind, and it's a revolution counter to the one we celebrate here. I'm a Chicagoan by birth, not from the South, wasn't born when most of the momentous events of the civil rights movement occurred, but I've worked on this project for 4 years, and I've listened and I've learned. I've met heroes of the movement who participated in the events that changed this country. My knowledge and empathy for this struggle has grown and deepened. And when I read about what happened at that Charleston church, I was overcome by a profound, bone-deep sadness. Sadness foremost for those killed, but also sadness of the persistence of hatred and stupidity. A hatred and stupidity that challenges all of us on the right side of history. Just 4 days before his murder, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. titled, "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." It's a call to action, challenging us to develop a world perspective. In it, he outlines the inescapable network of mutuality we all live in. He stated no individual can live alone, and if one feels they can, they are sleepwalking through this life. This idea, emphasized by Dr. King in many of his sermons and speeches, this network of mutuality and what it implies, connectedness, community, gave great moral power to the civil rights movement. I also see in this mutuality a thread which runs through the center's exhibits, and it's an idea I will return to. Since this building is opened, I've given many tours to a variety of visitors. More than a few times, at about the tour's halfway point, visitors have turned to me, and these are very intelligent and accomplished people, and said something to the effect of, "I don't usually like museums, but this is really good." It's heartening to know that Blake was not one of those people. He did not say that. So love them or hate them, museums have seen a small revolution in the past 50 years. Like many things, the winds of change began to blow in the 60s and were established later in the 70s and 80s. Traditional historical exhibitions considered, and still consider it, their main concern to collect and preserve, research, and publicly display authentic artifacts. In doing this, they perform a service of great import. These collections allow access to primary sources, and by doing this, they preserve knowledge. The curators base their story on the objects. You are sitting in a narrative history museum. The first major U.S. museum to champion this narrative approach was the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and I was there at the birth, being a member of that museum's founding staff. The curators, or more accurately, storytellers, base their story in a narrative and use objects in service of that narrative. This is a picture of some of the members of the planning and design team that worked on telling the story of the Holocaust. I was sitting right here. Cropped out by history, but now you know, So the way we went about telling the story of the Holocaust went beyond displaying collective items. There's a psychology at play here. Drawn into the flow of the narrative, visitors view the displays with their senses tuned to sequence, coherence, and transformation. They not only register isolated facts, they also search for meaning. They walk through the exhibit galleries as if walking through a movie whose meaning transcends the original historical limitations of time and space. Comprehension of the narrative and its meaning is an intellectual and emotional experience. The emotional effect can be comparable to that of narratives in novels, plays, and movies. All of these are based on plot. The plot triggers identification, which envelopes us mentally and forces us to relate to the meaning of the story. This emotional involvement opens us up to educational influence. A main emphasis now becomes the storytelling, organization, structure, narrative, drama, in other words, the plot. The most succinct way of talking about it is this quote from Abbott Miller of Pentagram, which I think is just really spot on in all my experience, that it's a room with a plot. As you take a look at the center's storytelling approach for two of our galleries, the Civil Rights Gallery and the Human Rights Gallery, I'd like to mention a bit about the process and the players involved. The planning and design team was multidisciplinary, drawing from the worlds of theater, filmmaking, academia, and activism. I was hired to run the concepting, design, and development, production, and installation of the exhibits, along with coordinating with the architect and the general contractor on areas of overlap between the exhibitions and the building. This consisted of planning, art direction, budgeting, research, writing, and administration. So regarding this building and its exhibits, I do know where the bodies are buried. And for a couple croissants, I'll tell some stories about it later. In addition to George Wolfe, our human rights exhibit curator was Jill Savitt, a New York-based human rights activist specializing in genocide prevention. Our exhibit designer was the Rockwell Group, well known for work on restaurants, hotels, casinos, and the Oscars awards ceremony sets. Our filmmaker was Batwin and Robin, and the exhibit elements in the building's public spaces were done by Pentagram's Paula Scheer and the photographer Platon. Second Story did the exhibit's interactives. In January of 2012, we began a series of planning meetings at the Rockwell Group's office that took George and Jill's concepts and stories and started to give them three-dimensional form. After a 6-month concept design phase, a scale model and renderings were produced. And in these next few slides, I'd like to talk a bit about those, because most people here have an interest in design. The first gallery space you go into in the Civil Rights exhibit, you pass through a portal which has a photo collage of African-American Atlanta back in the day and white Atlanta back in the day, along with neon signage from that period. When you go into the first gallery space after that portal, it's a gallery about segregation, the era of segregation, with a few stories being told. Mentioned, I've worked on a number of exhibits. This one was unique in a number of ways. Foremost, that during that concept design phase, a lot of the initial ideas and the rough visual aesthetic about how we would tell those stories was kind of nailed quickly, which is great but unusual. So at one point, if you've seen the exhibits, you'll recognize some of this. If you're going to go see them, please make note, these television totems in the front on the right-hand side. This idea was how to show what that era of segregation was like. You heard the audio before. There's an immersive intention with a lot of what we tried to do. These TVs stacked on these poles, the housings we bought on eBay, they're 1950s housings, modern guts, and the videos on them are the words and speeches of elected leaders during the era of segregation, the public utterances of those who held the levers of power, so sheriffs and judges, governors, mayors, and what they said publicly in these speeches is racist and vile. But it's a sense to show that this is the world that segregation was about. These are the people who controlled power. This is what public discourse was like. There's the Rockwell Group, and I'll get to that in a second, besides the renderings, did a model, scale model, and a couple of the things up there show photographs of that model. The March on Washington is the largest, most celebratory space in the Civil Rights exhibit. It was meant to put you back into the events of that day. There are 4 ceiling-mounted projectors on this large wraparound wall. The speeches, the music, the hustle and bustle of the event, the organization, the people moving to and fro. This film recently has won an award. It's been very, very successful. I was around when Representative Lewis was watching it and former Mayor Andrew Young, and both of them teared up. It's a pretty powerful piece, which is obviously the intention. On the back of the wall are graphics and images and text that explain the planning of the march with its antecedents going back into the 1940s, and then the events of the day with oral history, audio wands where you can listen to all the speeches that were given. Here's a photograph of that model, the scale model that the Rockwell team built. They built one of the Civil Rights exhibit, they built one of the Human Rights exhibit, and they built one of the King Gallery and the main building envelope, so we could see how all these spaces fit within. One of the most important things I think that we got right on this project, hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm patting ourselves on the back too much, but when you all came in through the kind of the back door, the main entrance is upstairs off Pemberton Place, so that's the main access and egress route. When you walk into it, when you approach the building, you walk into it, we really wanted to build an experiential element right away. I mean, how do you as a visitor coming to this experience the building, the space, the topics? I think we got this right by bringing in storytelling into the lobby and also building a synergy with the exhibitions, with the architecture of the building. And these models really helped to capture that. So there were a few people on the planning team who didn't have a lot of three-dimensional experience, so these models really helped in orchestrating and gaining knowledge as to how the storyline, that narrative I mentioned, plays out in the built environment. Freedom Rider bus, every civil rights museum has their bus. Some of them are real, ours is not, it's a scenic element. There are a few things exhibit technique-wise that we found were very successful with this. First off, the state of Mississippi was very dutiful in documenting all the people that they arrested. These are mugshots of these people who are Freedom Riders. It's public domain. You can go to the Mississippi State Archives and get these images, which is what we did. So it's an interesting visual idea on the scenic element of a bus. So as you approach it, A, visual interest, but B, before you read any text panels or listen to any of the oral histories, which you can do with a wand, audio wand, you see black and white faces. You see male and female faces. So information is already being presented that you're taking in before you even get up to the bus to read more about it. This is a picture of the model. This is a gallery that's about the assassination of Dr. King. Those TVs come back. Again, Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. So the period housings are late 60s, modern guts, playing on the video pieces as footage of the events of the day and how the media covered and portrayed Dr. King's assassination. And the last slide is about the Human Rights exhibit. It shows, again, this harkens back that conceptually, aesthetically, the team really very early on got right a bit of the main aesthetic vibe and the built environment. Open ceilings, supposed to look like a modern art gallery, grayish white walls, wood floors. Those suspended cones or walk-in mini theaters, we called them the hair dryers. They look like old hair dryers back in the day. And then the graphics and stuff, very quickly. I mean, again, this was in the first few months of the process. This was nailed. The development of the exhibit was coordinated with the building's architect, Phil Freeland. In another series of meetings, the exhibit and the architecture teams worked to choreograph the public spaces and the galleries, that synergy that I was mentioning before. This design development took place from mid-2012 through the summer of 2013. This entailed a lot of making, image research and acquisition, exhibit script writing, filmmaking, graphics, interactive design and development, construction drawings. Production and construction and installation was from autumn of 2013 through opening just over a year ago, June 23rd, 2014. In conclusion, through the telling of this large story of social revolution by means of a small revolutionary approach, I'm led back to Dr. King's idea of the inescapable network of mutuality. The creative community hears a lot about the importance of storytelling, so much so that I fear that it's become a bit cliche. But what is storytelling actually? Based on my experience, it revolves around the power to form and enlighten a person's moral imagination, helping us to experience ideas emotionally and imaginatively through different types of telling. The moral dimension implied in Dr. King's mutuality and within storytelling has the ability to connect us all on a high level. If the telling is done right, it will resonate, providing meaningful engagement with others and the world. It's another type of revolution, both large and small. Thank you. We wanted, George Wolfe had a lot to say in how we structured the civil rights exhibit, and he comes from Broadway. So he wanted a very theatrical, controlled black box, I guess is one way of talking about it. So there's very bright stage lighting, very well orchestrated throughout. And you'll get that. I mean, the civil rights story is a story of loss, struggle, death, and violence. It's a difficult story in certain parts, and the lighting helps play off of that. The beginning part of the exhibit is more darkly lit. When you come to the March on Washington, there's a little bit of a reprieve. You go back into then the violence that occurred very quickly after the success of the March on Washington with the murder of the 4 little girls and the bombing of the church in Birmingham, and then into Dr. King's assassination. But for Dr. King's assassination, you'll begin to go up some stairs. The stairs do a couple things. Verticality in three-dimensional environments is always interesting. It always helps to that immersive quality for visitors. So as you move up, there's that. You've seen the assassination, you begin this ascension. The content as you begin this ascension is very difficult. It's the assassination, it's the balcony. It mimics the balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis where Dr. King was assassinated. However, when you come up to the final gallery of the Civil Rights exhibit called Requiem. And there are a few stories being told there, but that space is white space. The laws that I mentioned, which we have a wall of laws, it's white on white, three-dimensional type. So that room is brighter. Again, there's some difficult stories in there, but again, there's this sense of ascension, which plays into this idea that I'd mentioned, that the civil rights movement succeeded. It was a success despite all of the difficulties of it. And again, from George's point of view, this is something that needs to be mentioned more. So there's this movement through dark, difficult stories, through dark and controlled lit spaces, up into an ascension. And then when you make a transition to go from civil rights to human rights, you come into a space with an oculus, the fancy architectural word for a skylight. So there's natural light. You haven't had any natural light yet in the exhibition, but you do when you come into that space, which is an elliptical form, and there's AV that plays around it. When you go into the human rights exhibit, there is a window in the back, which is actually, this is the back of the building. So you have natural light coming into it, and again, the sense of a modern art gallery. So from darkly lit, more controlled spaces that is sequenced and choreographed to the different stories you're telling, and then this ascension into a brighter lit space, and then in the Human Rights Gallery, more of a naturally lit space. Was the exhibit designed around the narrative and experience, or is it designed around the feelings? It was designed around the narrative. In those initial planning meetings, and I use George's name a lot, but he was the one who blocked out the storyline for the civil rights exhibit. He had a sequence of what he wanted to tell, and the process then was the way to tell it. So there is a narrative that is the backbone. It's an outline. He did a sketch that remains very true to what it was, going from something about the segregationists, going to Jim Crow laws, going in that first gallery, something about Auburn Avenue and how it was the center of a very vibrant African-American community in Atlanta. He knew he wanted to tell those types of stories, going into the civil rights movement, the tactics and strategies it used to further its cause and to push its agenda. So we knew that. We had that as a backbone. All of the emotion comes into how you tell that story. What are the ones that, the stories you choose to tell? That's the little snapshots that I tried to give were these people who, you know, a white housewife in Detroit that was so moved by what she saw on TV that she went down there and she pays the ultimate price. So it's like adding that type of, you know, story, that type of detail, and the way you do it on that structure of an outline, that's where you get into the emotion. And the structure has an intellectual component, and also the way you talk about what happened to Viola has an intellectual component, but then the way you tell the story and the facts has lots of emotion. So one of the things actually, going back to my experience at the Holocaust Museum, which was very similar to this, one of the main challenges for the civil rights exhibit is how do you control that emotion? I mean, how do you, it's so emotional, it's so difficult, there's such a struggle in it, you have to, and by control I just mean how do you architecturally structure it, that it's not all emotion, because that can be detrimental to a visitor. It can, you know, too much emotion can be too difficult for some people, so you have to think about it that way. How do we update the human rights exhibition content? So I'll get to that real quickly in a second, but the civil rights exhibit, it's a set historical narrative, it's a beginning. Our chronology for the exhibit is 1954 to 1968. If further scholarship dictates, we would begin to address those changes in the civil rights exhibit, but odds are, you know, it's going to be that way for a while. The human rights exhibit, that's a great challenge. Any exhibit you do, you have a set amount of linear real estate. How do you add to it? Our answer to that, like many other institutions, is digital. There's a lot of interactives, film, digital components that will add to it. There are text panels too, but those walk-in mini theater films, we're in the process of updating those. The way we choose, Jill Savitt was our curator. She was hired for the project, and now she's not. She's kind of a consultant. She does things because we ask, and she likes us, and we like her. But we get feedback from people. You know, if you have ideas and you wanted to chat, that's one way we get feedback. People who come say, hey, where's this story? Where's that story? We make a list, and we have a committee in-house that begins to work through that. Once we come up with what the next film will be, and I believe it's going to be environmental justice, some of our staff has connections in that community. We reach out to them, we'll bring them on board as a storyteller. Bring on board means we'll pay them, they'll come on board, the storyteller, and they'll help us tell that story. So it's feedback we get, and it's also what some of the people in the leadership see as issues that are happening. I mean, we're a year old, just a year old, so some of this we're learning, but the way we update it is, the plans to update the human rights exhibit stuff is because it's all, you know, digital and video. Yeah, so the Lunch Counter Interactive, which has really been more successful than we'd ever thought successful by the way visitors have responded to it. It's also won some awards. This was George's idea. George wanted to give people today a sense of what it might have taken courage-wise to go sit and do what these protesters did. That's why some of the language is difficult, or, you know, when you put it on, hopefully you'll have a chance to go listen to it if you haven't heard it, but it's even more intense than what you heard here. It's pretty amazing. I mean, I've seen people break down. So this was his idea to try to recreate on a small degree, and again, it's a recreation. It's nothing like what the people who actually did it had to live or suffer through, but to give a sense to a modern audience today, to people who've just come from the world of Coke or seen the fish at the aquarium, how do you give them an entry point into the story? So that was one of the ways to do it. And that was, again, his idea. Then we work with Batwin and Robin as the filmmaker. They work with George on his Broadway plays, Linda Batwin, Robin Silvestri, Batwin and Robin. They helped us script it. Now, this is kind of a funny aside. Tell me if I'm talking too much, but a funny aside. So we worked with Batwin and Robin to script out. Everything you heard was scripted based on historical facts. We had a historian help us with it. Scripted it out, so it was all made from scratch for us. George was involved. They sent a rough cut down for us, the team in Atlanta, to listen to. Again, I'm a Chicagoan by birth, so we played it for some of our colleagues, and they're like, these voice talent actors in New York have no idea what a Southern accent sounds like. So the feedback was, this was, what they were saying was fine, how they were saying it was really wrong. To my ear, it seemed okay, but so that was the feedback. They had to go back and find better Southern accents from people living in Queens, I guess. Given light of recent events over the past year and a half, you know, we're saying that the civil rights movement was a success, but we see things that show that maybe it wasn't a success. What are we doing about that? So I'm not a historian, but from the things I've learned, I mean, this historical event, and just 1 week ago, in this room for another event, was Representative John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette. They were getting some awards, but the conversation very quickly turned to what's happened in Charleston and along the lines of what you're saying. So we still, with the exhibits and what the historians told us, I mean, and John Lewis said this, I mean, this movement was a success. It did change the laws of this country. Is there still things that need to be done? Is the struggle over? By no means yet. By no means. It needs to. Obviously, the events you talk about, what happened in Charleston, show that. There is one space, there's so many things in the exhibit, I can only talk about so many in a brief time, but in that Requiem gallery where the laws are, they're interactive tables, and if you have the chance to go explore them, they talk, some of the content on those tables, which are updatable, is the ongoing need for vigilance, hate crimes and such. So you have that ability, we have the ability to add to it. Actually, one of my colleagues and I who are kind of tasked with making that happen, maybe not being the historians about it or the experts, content experts, but making that happen, we know we need to put that kind of content on. So yes, also our programming. I have colleagues, you know, in the museum, you do a lot of education and outreach and programming, so there are programs that are on those topics. The one, again, last week with Representative Lewis didn't start out to be about that, but it ended up a lot of the conversation being about that. So we see ourselves, the center sees itself, again, it's not my area specifically, but as a convener of dialogue. So when these issues happen, we have programming that talks about it.